How did Latin evolve over time? In this video, I'm going to give you a brief history of how Latin changed. Now, to understand how Latin developed, you have to know where it came from. And Latium is a small west coast region in Italy. It's really where Rome now is. But Latium is what the region was called before the rise of Rome. And you can see that is where we get the word Latin from. So the language of the area, Latium, became Latin, but it also has Etruscan, Phoenician, and Greek influences. It's very influenced by settlers from all of these places. Etruscan is from the north of Italy, Phoenician is sort of North African, and Greek settlers who came to Italy. It also has a very North Italian Celtic influence. So this is where we start. As Rome becomes more and more influential, its language becomes far more concrete and very individual compared to everything else. Across the whole span of the Roman Empire, however, we have Vulgar Latin. Now, Vulgar Latin is what we call the spoken language. It's from about the 8th century BC, so when Rome was founded, 753, to the 6th century AD, after the Western Roman Empire fell. So it spans a huge amount of time. The reason it's called Vulgar Latin is because it's not stylized like written Latin. Written Latin has a lot of rules, and it's very formulaic in parts, whereas Vulgar Latin is far more accessible. This is the spoken language, so of course it has to be much more flowing. However, we don't have a lot of records of this, because the things that have survived are written Latin, so they are far more highly stylized. We do have some evidence of Vulgar Latin from school books that say how they should write versus how they should speak. So it is interesting, but it does span the whole sweep of the Roman Empire, and we don't have very much of it left. What we do have is some Archaic Latin. This is from the 8th century BC to the early parts of the 1st century BC. So this is from right when Rome was founded all the way through to sort of the Ciceronian era, the 70 years BC, when the fall of the Republic is about to happen, the late Roman Republic. So Archaic Latin spans all of the monarchy and all of the Republic. It is influenced heavily by Greek, and you can see that in the way that the words end. So for example, instead of us and in the nominative and accusative second declension, it's actually os and which is very Greek. The bits of Archaic Latin that we do have are usually inscriptional, so on tombstones from this period, but also we do have very few pieces of literature that have been written in this style, as almost like if you were writing a book in Shakespearean language, you would hark back to that. But most of what we have is inscriptional. This changes when we get to Classical Latin. Now, there are two stages of Classical Latin. There's the Golden Age and there's the Silver Age, which I'll talk about later. So the Golden Latin is from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. It's split into two parts. There's the Ciceronian period to begin with, from the 70s to the, let's say, 30s. And then there's the Augustan period within this Golden Latin. And the reason it's called Golden is because it's the time that most scholars agree was the peak of Latin literature. So people like Cicero, hence the Ciceronian age, and then Virgil, Horace, and Ovid in the Augustan period were writing their most important and influential works. And we have so much left of this type of Latin because it was highly stylized, and people in the Renaissance especially really prized this. So this is the sort of thing that lasted because it was copied out again and again and again, because people thought it was the peak of literature. Then we have the Silver Age of Latin literature, which is from the 2nd to the 3rd century AD. So after the death of Augustus, sort of after Tiberius, it started to become dangerous to give speeches. So unlike in the Golden Age, when Cicero's speeches and Cicero's letter writing was very prized, that became quite a dangerous occupation because emperors had a lot of power and were not afraid to use it. So people like Martial, Juvenal, Tacitus, and the Plinies, the elder and the younger, became famous for their stories and their poems and their satire and their history. Then, after the 3rd century, we move into late Latin. It's quite a divisive topic, actually. People can't decide when it started and when it ended. The general consensus is that it starts in the 3rd century and it goes all the way through to the 10th century AD. But the 10th century AD is 500 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And so this is the language that actually developed into Romance languages. So Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. These are the languages that are developing from late Latin in this period. It very much looked back to Classical Latin but was developing into new languages. So in the different geographical areas, it was changing in different ways. There was no longer the cohesion of the empire to keep these languages as one. They had fractured into the different Romance languages. Part of this is also Church Latin. Now, it's also called Ecclesiastical Latin. It has use in the church for services. It sort of goes from late Latin all the way through to modern day. People still learn Ecclesiastical Latin now. There are differences in grammar between classical and ecclesiastical Latin. If any people have studied Latin and go to church and expect, especially Catholic churches, to use usual Latin, they get a little bit of a surprise, but it's very similar in lots of ways. The reason that it's used is that the Roman Catholic Church wanted a worldwide language to worship in. And so they picked Latin because Christianity began in the Roman Empire. So they wrote their services in Latin and they could give it to lots of different people and everyone would have the same way to worship. So if you were a Christian and went to Spain, you would be able to have the same experience as you would if you were in Constantinople, for example. Next, we have medieval Latin, and this is very heavily influenced by ecclesiastical Latin, by Church Latin. It's mainly used for legal and administrative uses. It has wild discrepancies because everyone is using it in a slightly different way. It's not as formulaic, it's not as clear-cut as ecclesiastical Latin. So some people use different forms of words for different things, and it's quite a lot of a mess, to be honest. It does have these links, as I said, to Church Latin, but mainly it links to classical Latin. It's trying really hard to be back in the golden age of Latin literature, but with these wild discrepancies, unfortunately, it can be quite difficult to read some of this medieval Latin. Finally, I'm going to talk about Neo-Latin. Neo-Latin is mainly from the Renaissance to kind of the modern day. It's especially Central European culture. The people in the Renaissance period really wanted this idea that the Europeans had the same culture, and they wanted to capitalize on that. And so it links back to the golden age of Latin literature. People really wanted their Latin to emulate that of Virgil and Cicero and Horace and be very highfalutin in the language they were using. The reason I've mentioned Neo-Latin is that it's very important for scientific vocabulary. This is the era when lots of genuses of plants and animals are being named, and they use Neo-Latin. So a lot of this is looking back to Golden Latin, but also using it in the modern day to classify new species that are being found. If you'd like to get more into actually learning Latin, you can download my free guides from the link in the description below. I've got one that's all about Latin verbs, and I've got one that's about Latin nouns. You can get them for free in the link in the description. Just type in your email address and you'll get them delivered straight to your inbox. I hope this has been interesting. I found it really interesting to research, actually, so I hope you agree. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time on bambasbat.